Narellan, New South Wales, 1888, 11 kilometres from Camden, where corrugated iron sheds and weatherboard cottages define the landscape. And then this, turrets, towers, chimneys that pierce the sky like factory stacks, a sprawling mansion of raw red brick that was never meant to be rendered. This is Camelot, though it was christened Kirkham by the man who paid for it. Cost, funded entirely, legend says, by a single racehorse. Built by Canada's most radical architect working in Australia. Duration of owner's enjoyment, 2 years before death. But that's just the fairy tale they want you to believe. Because beneath this fairy castle, literally in its basement, are the stone foundations of an early colonial flour mill built with convict labour. Above those foundations, in the hay shed behind the mansion, a wealthy pastoralist set himself on fire in 1912. And for 50 years after, the house was maintained entirely by women, a widow and her daughter, after the men who built it died or destroyed themselves. Today, you know this house as Ash Park from A Place to Call Home. You can hire it for your wedding, you can photograph yourself on its lawns, but how did a champion racehorse pay for a castle? What drives a man to architectural excess this extreme? And what does the hidden history of this mansion tell us about Australian wealth and tragedy? If you enjoy deep investigations into Australia's grand estates and the violence required to build them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which property to explore next. Your support makes these stories possible. Let's begin. This story doesn't begin in 1888 with James White's racehorse winnings. It begins in 1795 when escaped cattle from Sydney Cove were discovered breeding wild in what Europeans promptly named the cow pastures. But of course, it wasn't empty land. This was Murrungong country, Dharawal and Gundungurra people who'd lived along the Nepean River for at least 50,000 years. They called it other names. They used it for other purposes. By 1795, it was being measured for pastoral grants. The soil was extraordinary. Early settlers wrote that it could clothe the world in barley and rye. Within 15 years, the entire district had been parcelled out to officers, colonial officials and speculators. One of them was John Oxley, Surveyor General of New South Wales, the man responsible for mapping the theft. In 1810, Oxley received a grant of 600 acres. He extended it to a full estate in 1815. He named it Kirkham, after Kirkham Abbey in Yorkshire, because you always named your Australian property after the English place you'd left behind. That was the rule. But here's what makes Oxley's Kirkham architecturally significant. In 1816, he built stables. However, Oxley did not live to see the industrial milling operation. After his death in 1828, a flour mill was erected on the property by John Coghill, creating industrial-scale wheat processing. The mill building itself is gone, but, and this is architecturally fascinating, its foundations weren't demolished. They're still there. When James White built his mansion in the 1880s, he built it directly over and around the mill foundations. The basement of the fairy castle is the industrial basement of the flour mill. The kitchen stores sit on convict-laid stone, literal layers of history. The leisure-class castle sitting on top of the working-class factory. By the 1860s, the Oxley family faced mounting financial pressure. A wheat rust fungus, a microscopic parasite, swept through the district. Crops failed. The mill sat idle. Dependent on a single agricultural economy, the family's wealth evaporated. By the late 1870s, Kirkham was on the market. The flour mill era was over. The industrial dream had collapsed. And that's when the Turf King arrived. James White was everything the colony celebrated. Pastoralist, politician, member of the Legislative Council. But most importantly, he was chairman of the Australian Jockey Club from 1880 to 1890. He didn't just own racehorses, he industrialised the breeding of champions. And the legend, the story everyone tells, is that Camelot was paid for by a single horse, Chester. Chester won the Victoria Racing Club Derby and the Melbourne Cup in 1877. He placed Shorthead second in the AJC Derby that same year, showing his dominance in racing. The prize money and subsequent stud fees were enormous. Local folklore insists the entire mansion was funded by that single champion. Now, is that literally true? Probably not entirely. White was already wealthy from pastoral holdings, but it's symbolically perfect. a castle built on the ephemeral luck of the racetrack. Permanent architecture funded by the temporary glory of a 3-year-old thoroughbred. Money earned from horseflesh and fortune, the racetrack gamble made permanent, in stone. White transformed Kirkham into an industrial breeding operation. The champions that came from this property read like a roll call of Australian racing royalty: Nordenfelt, AJC Derby winner; Trident, dominant in the stakes; Singapore, another Derby winner; Martini Henry, the imported New Zealand sire that established the bloodline. This wasn't a hobby farm. This was a genetics program. This was selective breeding at industrial scale. This was turning biological reproduction into guaranteed wealth. And White needed a house that announced that power. James White hired John Horbury Hunt, and if you know anything about Australian architecture, that name should make you sit up. Hunt was Canadian-born, Boston-trained, and deeply influenced by the American arts and crafts movement. He'd emigrated to Australia and immediately began agitating against everything Sydney architects were doing. Sydney in the 1880s was a city of white-rendered villas, stucco, plaster, materials that pretended to be stone but weren't. Hunt called it sham. He built in raw, red brick, honest materials, visible structure. He didn't render it. He didn't hide it. The brick was the beauty. In a white city, Hunt built red, and James White loved it. Hunt's design for Kirkham, this is before it was renamed Camelot, was radical. No Georgian symmetry, no classical balance. Instead, organised chaos. Look at the roofline. Turrets with candle snuffer conical roofs, stepped wings, projecting bay windows creating deep shadows, and chimneys, massive brick chimney stacks that look like factory smokestacks. The kitchen chimney alone is industrial sized. This wasn't decorative. This was functional for a house that needed to feed dozens of staff and host racing industry parties. The main staircase is housed in that semicircular tower. It winds upwards, emphasising the vertical drama Hunt was creating. This is architecture as theatre. Hunt designed for effect. The principal reception rooms featured elaborate detailing and generous proportions, clearly designed for the large-scale entertaining that would characterise a racing dynasty's social calendar. Physical evidence of the parties, the champagne, the celebration of wealth generated by horses running in circles. But here's what tells you everything about James White's priorities. The stables Hunt designed are considered the finest he ever built. A majestic church-like roof with elaborate arched wooden ribbing. The floors weren't stone, they were timber planked, softer on the horses' hooves. White's horses lived in a cathedral. His workers lived in cottages. That's the hierarchy, made architectural. Hunt didn't just design the main house. He designed the entire precinct, a beehive-shaped brick smokehouse for curing meats, a technical feat of masonry, an octagonal aviary that elevated poultry farming to high art, a 2-story gardener's lodge with diamond-patterned shingles ensuring even the head gardener lived in style. This was a village, a company town, a self-contained world where every building announced status. The mansion was completed in 1888. James White died in 1890. 2 years. He lived in his masterpiece for 2 years. He built a monument to his racing dynasty, his wealth, his vision, and then he died at his Sydney residence, Cranbrook, having barely occupied the castle his racehorse paid for. His wife Emily inherited it. She maintained the stud for a decade, then sold. The fairy tale was already over. In 1900, the property was purchased by the faithful Anderson family, wealthy Goulburn pastoralists, and it was Frances Faithful Anderson who renamed it Camelot. She stood on the Nepean floodplain, looked at the turreted red brick mansion rising from the morning mist, and remembered Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. On either side the river lie, long fields of barley and of rye, that clothe the world and meet the sky, to many-towered Camelot. It's a beautiful image, romantic, Arthurian, the fairy castle, but Tennyson's poem isn't a happy one. The Lady of Shalott is cursed. She's trapped. She can only see the world through reflections in a mirror. When she looks directly at reality, she dies. Maybe Frances should have chosen a different poem. Frances's husband was William Hugh Anderson, wealthy pastoralist, former alderman, sportsman. On paper, he had everything, but William Hugh Anderson struggled with what they called melancholia and neurasthenia, Victorian terms for depression and nervous exhaustion. His health declined. He withdrew from public life. On May 16th, 1912, a fire broke out in the hay shed at Camelot. When they found William Anderson's body in the debris, the coroner's ruling was direct. Death caused through his own act. He'd set himself on fire, in the hay shed, behind the fairy castle, the same stables where James White's champion horses had once been kept. Frances survived him by 36 years. She lived at Camelot until her death in 1948. Her daughter Clarice remained as a life tenant until 1979. Let that sink in. From 1912 to 1979, 67 years, this house was maintained by women. After the men who built it died or destroyed themselves, Frances and Clarice kept it standing. Through World War I, through the Great Depression, when they had to let the servants go, through World War II, through the social revolution of the 1960s. They preserved Hunt's architecture. They maintained the gardens. They kept the 1816 stables from collapsing. They protected the Victorian stained glass by Lyons, Wells, Cottier & Co. Nobody tells you this story when they talk about Camelot. They talk about James White and his racehorse money. They talk about Hunt's architectural genius. But the house survived because of Frances and Clarice. People say Camelot is haunted, and there's legitimate folklore here, but you need to separate truth from internet confusion. Many ghost hunting sites conflate Camelot with Monte Cristo Homestead in Junee. Stories about a Ryan family finding choked chickens or seeing lights in a house with no electricity. Those are Monte Cristo stories, not Camelot stories. But Camelot has its own genuine ghosts. The White Lady. Persistent sightings of a woman in white in the gardens and upper windows. Believed to be Frances, still watching over her many-towered home. The Burning Man. The hay shed and stables have a heavy, sorrowful atmosphere. People report feeling sudden grief, unexplained cold spots, atmospheric phenomena, disembodied whispers, unexplained mists, sudden fainting spells in the upper levels. And some say James White lingers, the patron who died so soon after completion, still walking his 2-year investment. In 2013, Camelot found a new life as Ash Park in the 7 network drama, A Place to Call Home. For 6 seasons, it played the seat of the Bligh family, a post-war pastoral dynasty wrestling with secrets, class anxiety, and resistance to change. The casting was perfect. The house's fairy castle aesthetic created a visual metaphor, a gilded cage for characters trapped by class, wealth, and expectation. Before that, it was Lady Sarah Ashley's English estate in Baz Luhrmann's Australia. The house has become a character actor in film and television, playing English estates, pastoral wealth, and Gothic romance. Today, Camelot is privately owned and has been significantly restored by its current stewards. The estate has been thoughtfully preserved and maintained, and they've opened it as a high-end wedding venue. You can get married here. You can have your ceremony in the sunken garden. You can photograph yourself against the olive hedge that's been there since the 1880s. The stables where James White kept his champions. Wedding photo backdrop. The gardens where Frances found solace after her loss. Reception venue. Is that appropriate? Is that disrespectful? Or is that the only way heritage survives in Australia? By making it commercially viable? Camelot is on the New South Wales State Heritage Register. It's protected. Legally, you can't demolish it or alter it without permission, but it receives minimal government funding for restoration. It's a private residence that has to pay for its own preservation. So the owners open it for weddings, or they rent it for filming, they charge for access. What's the alternative? Should the government buy it and turn it into a museum that nobody visits? Should it be left to decay because restoration is expensive and uncomfortable? Or is the wedding business, making couples pay to photograph themselves in someone else's tragedy, the only economically sustainable model for preservation? There are no easy answers, just expensive buildings and limited public funding. Stand back from Camelot. Look at what's actually here. In the basement, the 1816 flour mill foundations, convict-built, industrial. On the ground, the 1888 mansion, racehorse funded, architectural revolution. In the stables, the 1816 structure where horses lived better than workers, and the 1888 cathedral where champions were worshipped. In the hay shed, the ash and memory of William Anderson. In the gardens, Francis and Clarice's 67 years of preservation. On screen, the house playing itself, playing England, playing whatever fiction needs a castle. This building contains all of Australian history's contradictions. It's built on stolen Dharawal land, funded by horse racing gambling, designed by a Canadian radical, preserved by grieving women, monetized through weddings and film sets, and it's beautiful. That's the uncomfortable truth. John Horbury Hunt created something genuinely beautiful. Raw red brick that refuses to apologise for being brick. A roofline that's organised chaos. Spaces that manipulate light like a cinematographer. But that beauty sits on layers of violence, displacement, exploitation, tragedy. The fairy castle isn't a fairy tale. It's a ghost story. And the ghosts are real. They're just not supernatural. They're historical. Camelot asks us, what do we do with beautiful things built by questionable people with stolen wealth on taken land? Do we preserve them? Do we celebrate them? Do we let them decay? Do we turn them into wedding venues and pretend the past is just aesthetic? I don't have answers. I just have questions and a red brick castle that refuses to disappear. That's the story of Camelot. That's the story of Australia. Thank you for watching this investigation into Camelot Kirkham. If you found value in this deep dive, please support this channel through likes, subscriptions, and comments. Tell me which Australian estate you'd like to see explored next. These documentaries take weeks of research and production. Your engagement makes them possible. Until next time, keep asking questions about the buildings around you. Keep wondering who paid, who built, and what truth the architecture is trying to conceal.